Hey everyone, Tactics here, continuing my Season 1 Dungeon Guide series, where this time we're going to be diving into the City of Threads, discussing important boss and trash abilities, as well as how I recommend you handle them. If you're interested in a full list of abilities, a pug-friendly route, or just a guide in written form, check out my Season 1 spreadsheet or my written guides hosted on the Method website, both linked in the description below. Otherwise, before we actually start talking about trash in this dungeon, I want to quickly discuss the Shadecasters throughout this first area of the dungeon, which can actually be used to provide a buff to your group. These objects are in set positions before the first boss only, and they currently display an image of Queen Ansarek on them. However, if you have a rogue, a priest, or an engineer with at least 25 Kaz Algar skill, you can interact with these Shadecasters, granting all nearby party members 15% increased damage and healing for 30 seconds. This can be quite useful to help you deal with some of the dangerous pulls in this area, so make sure you are making use of these Shadecasters if you have the ability to activate their buff. In terms of the mobs in this area, for tank, Sureki Venom Blades are quite scary, as they will Venom Strike you for a nasty tank hit, as well as a poison, which you'll want to make sure is dispelled as often as possible. Sureki Silk Binders are the main caster in this area, and they have a random target channel in Silk Binding that will stun players if fully channeled, so make sure you use a CC or an interrupt to stop this cast. I recommend trying to save your interrupts though, because this mob also casts random target bolts, and so you can use interrupts there to reduce the overall damage. There are two big lieutenant mobs in this area, the first being the Royal Swarm God, and this guy's got the Ravenous Swarm ability, which deals pretty heavy damage over time to your entire group, so healers, make sure you are ready for this. It's quite dangerous, especially when in combination with those random target bolts we just discussed. They also have a random target frontal attack, which you just want to make sure you avoid. Herald of Ansarek is the other lieutenant mob in this area. They have an important kick in Twist Thoughts, which just deals a pretty big hit, as well as spawns a puddle underneath a random player, so make sure you kick every single cast of that. They'll also debuff a random player with the Shadows of Doubt magic dot. This deals pretty heavy damage, and then on expiration or removal, it'll shoot out 5 orbs that will stun anyone they hit. But I recommend this player stay as stationary as possible, backing up maybe a little bit if you're in melee, and then once they're still, everyone can position themselves accordingly to avoid getting hit by those stun orbs. Eventually, you'll make your way through all the trash in this area towards a bridge that leads you deeper into the city, and this is guarded by the first boss, Orator Krix'vixk. This is a rather claustrophobic fight, as the boss will use chains of oppression on anyone that moves more than 10 yards away, indicated by a small purple circle around the boss itself. So everyone needs to be on the same page here when it comes to movement, as pretty much every single ability involves either dodging or area denial. For dodging, Terrorize is a frontal on a random player, so it needs to be sidestepped by whoever is in the line, and this often overlaps with the Shadows of Doubt magic dot, which is similar to the one we just discussed, except now it goes out on 2 players instead of just 1. I recommend having the targeted players move towards the edge of the circle and then plant, giving other players both the space and the time to avoid any incoming orbs before the debuffs expire or are dispelled. This is also a good spot to pop a defensive if you're one of the debuffed players. For movement and party damage, you've got Vociferous Indoctrination, which will channel for heavy party damage and then spawn a puddle underneath the boss that slowly grows to 20 yards in size. This means that your entire group will need to move together to stay away from this growing puddle while avoiding taking extra damage from that chains of oppression we mentioned earlier. My recommendation here is to make use of the ping system. Just ping a few times in the direction you plan to move after the next puddle spawns, just so everyone is on the same page and can position accordingly. Outside of that, there's just a tank hit in Subjugate, so make sure you have a defensive running for each cast. From there, you can attempt to cross the bridge, but you'll face Zeph Itik before you get to the end, and you need to bring this mini boss down to 50% before he swaps sides and begins to help you. He's got a random target bolt here as well, which you can keep interrupts on. Other than that, it's just a bunch of swirlies for you to avoid. After you defeat him, you'll be able to exit the bridge and enter the High Hollows, disguised by the perfume that he gave you. Your goal here is to kill 4 Eye of the Queen lieutenants, along with the minions that spawn with them, in order to summon the next boss. You can find the position of these eyes by using the trail of shadowy figures that will appear when you're in the relative area. Now, these mobs do have several different spawn points. However, there is always one immediately upon entering the district. There's always one to the east, one to the south, and one to the west, so that narrows it down a bit. I recommend moving east first, then south, and then ending in the west, as this will make triggering the boss RP a little bit quicker after you're done, as that starts in the western part of this area. Note that throughout this district, there are several pale priest mobs patrolling around that can see through your disguise and will eject you from this area if you step into their detection radius, so make sure you steer clear of them. In terms of what these lieutenant mobs do, their main hit is Void Rush, which debuffs 4 members of your party, each one at a time, with a pretty nasty dot, so healers, make sure you are ready to heal through this. Then they also have a frontal attack. They'll teleport behind a random player and just shoot a frontal, so make sure you all avoid that. In terms of who they spawn with, Covert Webmancers are the caster mob in this area, and you want to keep kicks on the Grim Weave Blast. This just targets a random player, and it also bounces, so you want to make sure these are kicked to avoid that incoming damage. They also have a random target heal as well, which is a channel, so you can interrupt it before the cast, or you can let a single tick off and use a CC instead. Now, after you defeated all 4 eyes of the Queen, you need to go to the western part of the High Hollows, as I mentioned, and find Executor Nizrek, who after a bit of a jog and some RP will actually help you open the way forward and spawn the second boss. For this encounter, you've got 2 bosses who share HP, where in each phase one boss is empowered, needing to be picked up by the tank, and the other boss is just a bit more passive, just applying bleeds to random players that you need to heal through, along with one other ability depending on the phase. Starting in phase 1, Nyx will be empowered, and in this phase they'll cast the Shade/Frontal at the tank, so make sure you face the boss away from your group. When this happens, it also spawns a Shade that will echo Nyx's future attack, so generally my recommendation is to try and cluster these Shade spawns into one smaller area, and then when you re-enter this phase, you just pick a new spot away from these old Shades to avoid all those echoed abilities. Outside of that, Nyx will channel Duskbringer for some raid damage, also spawning a 15-yard AoE around himself and any Shades that you need to make sure you run out of, and healers, be prepared to keep players topped through this ticking damage. This cast can be quite scary in phase 1 specifically because it overlaps with Vix's main ability, Ice Sickles, which shoots a line at all 4 non-tank players and applies a 12-second magic dot and slow to anyone that it hits. This is probably the scariest moment of the entire fight every time it happens, so make sure you are using a defensive or group CD or just healing throughput to keep players topped. Players should also make sure that they aren't stacked in order to avoid cleaving their Ice Sickle lines, and if you have the ability to dispel either magic effects or freedom slow effects, use this to mitigate that dot damage. At 100 energy, the bosses shift from phase 1 to phase 2 by casting Synergic Step, charging at a random player 3 times, and then dealing damage to anyone in a line. Just make sure you are avoiding these hits. When you enter phase 2, Nyx is now going to be the one throwing out random target bleeds, and Vix will be empowered, gaining the Rhyme Dagger ability. This ability deals both heavy tank damage and it has a party hit, so tanks, you want to make sure you are using a defensive for every single hit. It also debuffs the tank with 10 stacks of the Freezing Blood dot, which can only be cleared by standing within 10 yards of another player at a rate of 1 stack per second per nearby player. This means that if your entire group is stacked up when this ability goes out, you'll lose 4 stacks of the dot every second. This, of course, is ideal, so generally I do recommend having your entire group stack whenever you're in phase 2. There is an overlap towards the end of this phase where Nyx will cast Dustbringer, that AoE with a 15-yard circle, at the same time as this Rhyme Dagger hit. So similar to the first boss here, you want to make sure that you know and you are dodging as a group here to help reduce the stacks on the tank. So again, pinging here can be a good thing just to make things a little bit easier. And then from there, the boss uses Synergic Step once again when they get to 100 energy, and then they move back into phase 1 and the fight just repeats. Moving up the hill here, tanks, you need to be aware of these Sureki conscripts. These guys look unassuming, but they've got an instant cast Tank Buster in Brutal Jab, which deals a couple hits of physical damage, but more importantly, applies a stacking 10% physical damage taken increase for 10 seconds. And this can get out of hand quickly if there are a lot of these mobs in a pull, so make sure you are aware of your debuff stacks and you start to kite if needed. The mini boss in this area is the Royal Venom Shell, and the important ability is the Venomous Spray. This applies a poison dot to your entire party, while also constantly spawning 3-yard swirlies around it that you need to be dodging. These are very, very lethal, so make sure you are avoiding those swirlies. Use as many poisonous spells as you have, and then heal through the rest of the damage. This guy also has a random target frontal, similar to the lieutenants at the beginning of the dungeon, so make sure you avoid that cone. Inside the building here, you'll find Sureki Unnaturalers, and they have the most important interrupt with Void Wave. This is a 50-yard AoE knockback hit, and it also stacks up a Shadow Dot on the entire group. So very, very dangerous, especially because if you get knocked into any of the cocoons here, you will spawn Ascended Neophyte mobs with just random target bolt players. So you want to avoid that as much as possible. If you make your way towards the center of this building, you'll find a bunch of slime mobs that you can kill in order to summon the third boss. And this is basically just a big area denial fight thanks to the Viscous Darkness cast. This deals some damage to all players, it knocks them back a little bit, and most importantly, it spawns a bunch of these shadowy orbs around the edge of the room that slowly float towards the boss. This will heal the boss for 7% of its health if they reach them, so players need to make sure they are intercepting these orbs, but when they do so, they will spawn a puddle on the ground, and they will gain a healing absorb. Because your space is somewhat limited here, I recommend pulling the boss to one of the sides or corners of the room, and then just pick a direction here. I believe we went clockwise around the room that you're going to rotate in, and your goal here is to just soak as many orbs as you can within the same general area that you're starting in, and then just rotate around the room as your quadrant begins to fill up. To make this a bit more difficult, occasionally the boss is going to spawn a puddle underneath himself with Blood Surge, and this also is an 8-yard AoE, so mainly need to get out of it. Ideally, I recommend you wait until this Blood Surge cast before you do a bigger movement, because this puddle is quite large, and otherwise you need to do potentially 2 large movements back to back, which could lead to you running out of space. For tanks, there's the Oozing Smash hit, which also leaves a nasty healing reduction on you, so make sure you are popping a defensive here, and be careful how many orbs you soak when you have that debuff. Outside of that, at full energy, the boss will channel heavy party damage with Dark Pulse, and this is where you want to commit things like group defensives and healing CDs. From there, you can make your way to the final boss room, and before getting into it, if you learned something from this video and you want to see more content like it, please hit that subscribe button, as it's the best way to support me. Anyways, as you enter Izo's room, you'll trigger some RP that spawns 2 mini-bosses that you can pull separately, where each previews one of the boss's abilities. To start is Elder Shadeweaver, and they've got the Umbral Weave attack. This basically just hits the entire party and spawns a root that you can also attack on them. So you want to stack up here, you can cleave these roots down, and of course, if you have a freedom effect, you can also instantly break these roots instead of needing to kill them to be freed. In addition to that ability, this mob will also just bolt random players, so keep an interrupt on that. The second mini-boss is the Hulking Warshell, and his boss ability is Tremor Slam. This is a big AoE party hit that also deals quadruple damage if anyone is within 12 yards of this mob, which is indicated by a small circle around the mob, of course. And then when this hit goes out, it also spawns 4 Hungry Scarabs that the tanks just bring these mobs underneath the mini-boss and cleave them down. After defeating the mini-bosses, you'll be able to take on Izo himself, who throughout this fight will spawn 3 shifting anomalies around himself, which he will then intermittently throw at random players, dealing damage to anyone in the path. You want to be aware of these at all times, and just like the previous boss, I do kind of recommend pulling Izo to one side of the room and then just rotating as a group around it, just to make it easier to avoid mechanics, as well as to keep you relatively stacked up, which helps with that Umbral Weave ability that I just talked about. As I mentioned with the mini-bosses, Izo uses both Tremor Slam and Umbral Weave. However, it's important to note that he doesn't always cast them in the same order, so be prepared for each set of abilities that either could come first. For Umbral Weave, like I mentioned, it's good to be as stacked as possible, just so you can quickly cleave players out of the roots, and any kind of freedom effects that you have in your group are very useful here to allow you to immediately cleanse some of those roots and make sure people are free before those orbs start getting thrown. For Tremor Slam, you want to make sure you get out of that circle that is around the boss, and tanks pick up the 4 Ravenous Scarabs here that spawn, so they can be cleaved down under the boss. These guys will also have a tank buster now, so be aware of that. If you see a little green circle, make sure you get out of it. Between these abilities, the boss will sometimes apply Splice to the party, which is just a shadow dot that healers will need to stay on top of. For tanks, there's the Process of Elimination Tank Buster, which happens when the boss reaches full energy, and this is where the boss just grabs all 3 of the anomaly orbs and throws them one at a time at the tank, each dealing significant damage to anyone within 10 yards. So everyone make sure to give the tank some space here, and tanks, if possible, take a few steps back away from the boss to allow any melee in your group to maintain uptime while this ability happens. From there, the boss just spawns his 3 shifting anomalies once again, and the cycle repeats. There we have it though, guys. Another dungeon guide in the books. Hopefully you learned something, and if you did, make sure you subscribe to the channel and go check out my other dungeon, raid, and tank guides, including gonna have some Keystone Hero and Portal guides coming soon, as well as some 0.1% title routes. Of course, I need to give a massive thank you to my amazing Patreons for their continued support. I really do appreciate it, and I'll see everyone in the next video.